I would think of cancer cells, this is a generality, as another variant of a stressed cell, is also resisting apoptosis as an example, right? So many of the interventions for cancer, the non-surgical ones, radiation, some oncology, are intended to cause cancer cells to go through apoptosis.
Our next guest, Dr. Kelly, has published hundreds of articles on natural medicine and nutrition. He's contributed 3 chapters to the textbook of natural medicine and has more than 30 journal articles indexed on PubMed. My goal is to help people live longer, happier, healthier, pain-free lives with science. As such, I love when I get a chance to interview other experts focused on the science. We will be talking about zombie cells, and if you want to avoid becoming a zombie, make sure you stay for this entire conversation.
One of the side effects of causing that stress on cancer cells and on healthy cells is that you actually make more senescent cells. What looks to be the case is people going through many types of cancer treatment would have more senescent cells. The original thought of why do we make senescent cells would be...
Hi, my name is Chris Burris. I'm a longevity expert and the chief scientist at a lab focused on a longevity molecule. My primary focus is to help people live longer and better lives with science. Make sure to subscribe and share so you and your friends can live longer and better. Well, actually, so you and your friends can live beyond the norms.
Hi, welcome to the next episode of the Live Beyond the Norms Health and Longevity podcast. We're here on a health and longevity podcast, and our next guest and I have some things in common that may surprise you. We both studied engineering for our undergraduate degrees, and if I read his LinkedIn profile properly, we both probably love to dance. Today we will not be dancing, but we'll be nerding out like you would expect 2 engineers to do. My goal is to help people live longer, happier, healthier, pain-free lives with science. As such, I love when I get a chance to interview other experts focused on the science. Our next guest, Dr. Kelly, has published hundreds of articles on natural medicine and nutrition. He's contributed 3 chapters to the textbook of natural medicine and has more than 30 journal articles indexed on PubMed. We will be talking about zombie cells, and if you want to avoid becoming a zombie, make sure you stay for this entire conversation. Dr. Kelly, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. I'm looking forward to it.
All right. So your educational background is incredibly diverse, from management engineering to a master's in Southeast Asian studies, which also included performing in modern dance, to a doctorate in naturopathic medicine, ultimately contributing 3 chapters in the textbook of natural medicine. Can you walk us through what in your background sent you in the direction of engineering, which included a stint in the ROTC, and then what was the transition through Asian studies, and finally, why naturopathic medicine?
Yeah, so engineering, that degree was kind of a stepping stone to being an officer in the Navy. I would say from in middle school, if someone said, "Oh, Greg, what do you want to be when you grow up?" I would have said, "Oh, I want to be in the Navy." And I was, good in math, sciences in high school. So, got a Navy ROTC scholarship. At the time, they really valued engineering degrees. So I basically took the easiest one that college called WPI offered at the time. Figured I'm not going to use it anyways. I might as well not kill myself over the next 4 years and just, so that, that's, I guess, the engineering thing. But I was always super good with math and science. And then my dad was an engineer. He's passed away now, but he was the president of about a 5,000 person big engineering firm in Boston growing up. And I think the Navy connection came before that. He worked at General Dynamics Navy shipyard in Quincy, Mass, near where I grew up. So anyways, that's the Navy piece. I grew up on the ocean between Boston and Cape Cod, little fishing town. So, oceans, I sometimes parse people into there's mountain people and there's ocean people. I'm definitely an ocean person. I would miss not being near it. And then in the Navy, what happened, and this was pretty quick, I got to my first duty station. It was in Coronado, California, so the San Diego area. And for the first time ever, people weren't putting all my meals in front of me. I was fortunate. I had a mom that made our meals. It is that time period in the 60s and early 70s. And then in college, the same meal plan. So long story short, it occurred to me I have no idea how to actually feed myself. And I had a friend I met that was in that same boat as me, went to that command. That was a gym rat, kind of bodybuilder type of archetype, right? Maybe not quite that big, but, fantastic shape. So I said, well, what do you eat? And at the time he gave me a book called Eat to Win by Elson Haas, which for listeners that can go back that far, it was a big popular diet book around 84, 85. That was the high complex carb, low fat type of approach to eating. And so that became my blueprint at that point. And I'm not suggesting that's the best way for people to eat, but that was the way young Greg ate. So I went to my first ship and I was the weird officer that went to the gym and ran, often bicycled in and out of, Pearl Harbor if our ship was in port, tried to eat really, cleanly compared to, most of the other officers. So long story short, towards the end of my time in the Navy, I owed 6 years, 4 active and 2 reserve, for them being so kind as to pay for my engineering degree. I had decided to get out at around the 5.5 year point of being active duty. At that point, I wasn't sure what was next. Was already doing some of the things to stay healthy, but mostly the exercise and eating well. And my plan, for lack of a better way to describe it, was to get rid of everything and just wander the earth for a bit and see what else was out there, right? Because I'd been pretty constrained between the military and then just college and everything before. So somehow it occurred to me in figuring that out in prepping that I should be able to take care of myself better, since I wouldn't know what existed in maybe some places I was wandering through for medical help. So just kind of backwards stumbled into herbal medicine, acupuncture, and a bunch of things like that I had never heard of at that point in my life, and thought, wow, this is super cool. I had no idea. And I was fortunate I hadn't been sick, so I hadn't needed either the existing medical system or alternative ones. But that kind of, in a meandering kind of way, led me to stop at Hawaii, start to take classes in Thai language to prep for Thailand. Was going to be the first place I was going to go, thinking, okay, I want to base in that language. And then it turned out the instructor said, oh, you should apply for a scholarship. There's, a handful that the U.S. government gives out because Thai is an understudied language. Maybe you'd get one. So I actually did get it. And so then it's like, okay, well, someone's going to pay for me to do a master's degree for the next 2 years as long as I study Thai. What should I study? So I just decided at that point, well, I was interested in herbs and things like that. Let me just focus on, more or less stitch together a educational program as a master's that builds into that area. So, I ended up specializing in kind of where diet and plant medicines, herbal extracts, interfaced in Thailand and Southeast Asia. Took some transpersonal psychology. I could kind of take anything I wanted as long as I did a research paper related to Thailand. So that you had mentioned dance, I could take a dance class and then do a paper on Thai traditional dance as an example, right? So, and then towards the end of that, maybe midway through that, I started taking yoga class. The instructor was a naturopathic doctor. Again, had never heard of that profession and just thought, oh, they've actually captured everything I'm interested in one profession. So, as soon as I finished the master's degree, I applied to naturopathic school, and then, immediately went that next fall. And to that, that was 1993. I started, as a first-year naturopathic student, and have been in the, more directly in the health world as my profession ever since.
Very cool. So, ocean person, as also evidenced by you being in San Diego still, and you just described before we got on, right next to the beach. Got a book, Eat to Win. Really, we're kind of an oddball. You'd be significantly less of an oddball now, right? Like there's officers who are training. I remember jogging with my dad, who was in the Air Force. By the way, thank you very much for your service. And so the mindset really kind of across society has changed a lot. Got a hold of the book, Eat to Win. And then really naturopathic medicine seemed kind of destiny, but you got there through a very kind of circuitous path, right?
Yeah, and my dad was a much more linear thinker, being the classic engineer, and I can remember at that point, even when I decided to go into what he thought was a weird thing to study for a master's degree, he's like, "Why don't you just take a job with an engineering company over in Southeast Asia? I could hook you up." And then naturopathic medicine, I just remember him shaking his head when I told him that was next on the menu. So,
yeah, I know that feeling. Having my dad been an officer, going different directions can cause some consternation with them. So today we're going to be talking about senolytics and senescent cells and the more fun zombie cells. Let's get some definitions out of the way. What are senescent or zombie cells?
Yeah, so the way I would think of them is they're a category of stressed cells that, because of the amount of stress they've undergone, they've essentially been prevented from making new cells, right? Like most cells divide to make clones of themselves. So, because these are fundamentally so stressed that they're unrepairable, they're also really frozen from making daughter cells. And then the way I think of it, I would then divide senescent cells into transient and lingering. And in an aging context, it's specifically lingering senescent cells that matter. And they have an additional characteristic, more than not being able to make, basically, divide again, is that they resist what's called apoptosis. And apoptosis comes from a Greek word that means falling off, in the context of fruit or leaves falling off a tree. So apoptosis is it's called programmed cell death, but it's a very organized, almost thought out way that cells would go about breaking apart and disintegrating at the end of their youthful life or useful life. And the transient senescent cells go through apoptosis for the most part. The lingering ones, by definition, resist apoptosis. And then really the last characteristic of a senescent cell is, and this was discovered by Judith Campisi, a Buck Institute researcher in the 2005 or so time period, is that they secrete what are often referred as SASP factors, SASP, but it's senescence associated secretory phenotype. But the long story short is that they secrete a whole bunch of inflammatory and other compounds into the microenvironment around them. So in an aging sense, when you say, okay, what's a senescent cell or what's cellular senescence? Cellular senescence by definition is, okay, the cell can't divide anymore. But a senescent cell in the aging sense also has those two other things layered on top, resisting apoptosis and secreting these inflammatory compounds.
So we've got transient and we've got lingering. My next question is are senescent or zombie cells, are they good? Are they bad? Maybe the transients don't really matter because they're going through the regular process, and the lingering are, but do they serve any other purposes, kind of other than kind of what you've laid out here so far?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and they would be very contextual, right? So like most things, right, in health. And so, like during embryonic development, as an example, senescent cells, and again, these would be the transient type, do things that are super important for fetal development and a healthy pregnancy. And by transient, what I mean is they kind of come in a wave and then they recede, right? They do their job and they're gone. They're either through apoptosis or the immune system would, find the stragglers, so to speak. Say someone's listening to this and they're 20, 25 years old, and for whatever reason, decided to do a much more strenuous type of exercise than they're used to doing, that's probably going to create at least some transient stress on that muscle tissue, right? Some inflammation will be built. That's actually a good thing, right? That inflammation is going to call in the immune system, help to repair and rejuvenate that tissue, right? And part of the reason we get, stronger, faster from exercises, we're stressing things a little bit. So as part of that process, some senescent cells would be made. They would act, in a sense, to call in the immune system and say, come here, like there's some stress in this area. Let's, repair that. And then those, so a couple of days later, a week later, if you looked at that tissue, there would have been a burst of senescent cells after that intense exercise, and then they would be cleared out of the tissue, either through apoptosis or through the immune system cleaning up the debris, because that's what the immune system does. But now if you fast forward and that same person, say, I'm 62, so it's my age, they do the same thing, there would be what would be often described as an explosion of senescent cells in that muscle tissue. And if we looked a week later, 2 weeks later, they wouldn't have been cleaned out. They would linger, right? So that's the distinction. Senescent cells have a really valuable job if they do it and go away. But when they stay lingering, then they take up more and more space, basically, in that tissue that should be filled with healthy cells that are more able to do a job to support that tissue. And then the SASP that I mentioned is just really detrimental. Like for many, many years, what's been thought as inflammaging, right, has been connected with, unhealthy aging, but aging of all sorts. And that lingering buildup of senescent cells directly contributes to what we would think of as inflammaging.
So it's not just that they're cells that aren't able to do their job anymore. It's which would require resources. So like hogging resources and not delivering any value. They actually have that negative component of. That's my understanding. So they're releasing inflammatory agents. Is that? Do I have that?
Yeah, and that's part, like the zombie idea that you introduced to the listeners is really because of two things they do. One, they resist apoptosis, right? So they're not live in the sense of a live healthy cell that can make new cells and divide, but they haven't gone through apoptosis, so they're not dead yet either, right? They're in this limbo between, right? So that's zombie-like. But then the SASP factors that they secrete into the microenvironment can stress nearby cells and turn them into senescent cells. Mm-hmm. So that's why the zombie analogy is used so much, because they're not alive, they're not dead, and they can create new versions of themselves that are also not alive and not dead. And as we get older, that's a big part of the reason that senescent cells almost build in a snowballing sense, because more beget more.
So clearly, and we'll get into this, clearly as we get older, we need to figure out ways to manage it. So as soon as you start talking about, kind of releasing these markers and potentially stressing other cells, and getting other cells involved in these clusters, like my mind goes to, is there a relationship between kind of senescent cells and cancers?
Yeah, and that's, I would say over the last 4 years on PubMed, there's been a lot there. Like, as an example, so I would think of cancer cells, this is a generality, as another variant of a stressed cell, right? That, is also resisting apoptosis, as an example, right? So many of the interventions for cancer, the non-surgical ones, right? Radiation, some oncology drugs are intended to cause cancer cells to go through apoptosis. Right, like they're actually saying, okay, let's put even more stress on them. We know that's going to stress out some healthy cells too, right? That's why there's often really at least temporarily bad side effects from those medications. But the goal is, let's tip some of the cancer cells that are resisting apoptosis finally there. So one of the side effects of causing that stress on cancer cells and on healthy cells is that you actually make more senescent cells. So, what looks to be the case is people going through many types of cancer treatment would have more senescent cells than other people their age would. Right? And some of that's extrapolating from animal studies, but that's for sure being investigated. And because of that, there's starting to be, at least, I would say it's more like people proposing a theory that maybe a better approach in the treatment of cancer would be a 1-2 step, right? Like, let's do the things to get rid of cancer cells, and then after, let's clean up the senescent cells. But super early on to say that medicine will go there, but that's being looked at right now. And then the original thought of, like, why do we make senescent cells would be, okay, a cell's super stressed, it's damaged, it's unrepairable. We don't want it to make new copies, because then that DNA may be damaged and it may predispose towards cancer. So the original thought about why do we make senescent cells was as something to prevent cancer. And that's probably true again, in that young person transient senescent cell analogy. But in the lingering ones, there's now, again, you always would want more research, but where the research is pointing now is because of what they're doing to the microenvironment, they're actually creating an environment that's more, I guess, welcoming to the growth of cancer. So that like the original thought of what they did was more preventive, where now scientists have got smarter about the lingering ones with aging. It's like, oh, maybe they're not. Maybe they're actually a net detrimental.
How do we identify senescent cells in our bodies? Like if we want to have some sort of understanding of, do we have a lot of senescent cells? Do we not have many? What does that look like?
So that's a great question. And the answer is there's no currently available way to do that readily. So what senescent cells would take a degree of expertise on the part of a scientist to identify. And they'll usually, like stepping back, there's no one marker that on its own would say this is always a senescent cell and not some other kind of cell. And so what they do is they'll usually look at a couple of different things. They'll look at the size and shape. They'll stain it with a specific color. They'll look for an enzyme called beta-galactosidase. They'll look for specific protein markers, P16, P21, that are characteristic of cells that are resisting apoptosis. And then it's that combination of things that they'll then define as a lingering senescent cell. And then, to get those requires doing some kind of a tissue biopsy. So, smart people at universities have been looking at, and Buck Institute of Aging has also been looking at, is there any marker in the blood that we can look at that would give insight into body burden of that? And to date, there's nothing that anyone's agreed on is a reliable marker. So what ends up happening is people fall back sometimes on, like inflammatory things in the blood, high sensitivity C-reactive protein, certain, interleukin 6, TNF alpha, but none of those are particularly sensitive for senescent cells. One lab was looking at beta-galactosidase in the blood. Maybe there's something there, but we had a few people do before and after beta-gal tests with senolytics, and to date, there's not a signal that we would say is clear. But my guess is that the precise timing of when you looked at it, because what may happen is when senescent cells die off, beta-gal is released and it would temporarily go up in the blood. So you might have to, know the exact window that you're looking for it. So all that stuff's still being sorted out, but or short answer is there's no great way. So then we're left almost with functional markers. And then does your audience know about like the different epigenetic clocks? Have you spoken?
I think it's worth diving into like right now. Yeah. Let's jump into it.
So there's what I thought of as the first, second, and third generation aging, like biological age clocks, which do DNA methylation, right? And then run it through algorithms to kind of predict a biological age or a pace of aging. And there's a lab called True Diagnostics. They offer that test, and they published a study. I think it came out about August of last summer, maybe. But they use quercetin and dasatinib, which is the most studied senolytic stack to date. And then towards the end, they layered fisetin on. They just didn't see a signal, and it somewhat varied. They ran a panel of I think 5 different clocks. But even before that, I'd spoken to Ryan, the founder of that company. They weren't optimistic that it would have a signal, and part of the reason is some of the smartest people with those clocks, had looked at senescent cells versus characteristic methylation patterns on non-senescent cells, and they just aren't the same. So it's just it's its own thing that has to be thought of as its own thing. So that technology doesn't seem to work. And so what, I at one point looked at clinicaltrials.gov and just said, okay, what are the registered trials that pharma companies are, putting in their trials as an outcome measure? And one of the things that showed up a couple different times was recruiting people with joint issues and doing a questionnaire called the WOMAC scale, which is by far the most common way that joint discomfort, activities of daily living, all the things that, the aging joints interfere with. Womack questionnaire was designed to put a number to that. And so, that's a functional way to kind of not determine, did this remove senescent cells, but did one of the things they cause get better, as an example.
And so that would be really kind of an indication of inflammation, right? It's really looking at core inflammation, and you just said that C-reactive protein doesn't seem to have any correlation with senescent cells. That's interesting. So
it may that's other IL-6, TNF-alpha, or CMP. Those are some other things that are being looked at. To date, there's just not been enough done. The whole field of senolytics is new. And then, the human trials, there's a whole bunch ongoing, but most of those haven't reached completion yet. So maybe there'll be something there that shows up with CRP. To date, there hasn't been, but it's in part because the field's early.
And what does your intuition say?
I think those are such general things and it's going to depend on how far out of normal someone is. I would expect if someone had a high CRP, it would say joint issues, and senolytics help the joint issues, we'd probably see, towards a normalization of some of these blood markers as well. But they would be a crude way to, they wouldn't be because they track with a lot of other things as well. And then the other thing with joints, just to finish that up, is that it was originally thought that the three types of cells most prone to becoming senescent would be immune cells. That would make sense. Fibroblasts, connective tissue cells, since they're so ubiquitous, and then endothelial cells. And why joints become such a natural thing is joints have, chondrocytes, but then they have fibroblasts. There's a gut immune joint axis, right? Immune system plays a prominent role in healthy aging with joints. And stepping back, at one point, they basically implanted senescent cells in joint cartilage of younger mice, and very quickly they developed what we would think of as arthritic joints. And part of what they saw in that study, it was almost like the senescent cells created a barrier over the stem cell niche and prevented the stem cells from rejuvenating the tissue. So joints make sense as a functional thing to almost infer that the senolytic is doing something helpful.
With joints being a really kind of inflammation, right? You think of arthritis as a disease of chronic inflammation. Is it potentially as simple as the senolytics are reducing inflammation, and maybe they are reducing inflammation by getting rid of the senescent cells? But what if it's just a really good anti-inflammatory? Do you have any kind of response to that?
No, I think that would be fair. Often we don't, like I said, the only way really to know did the senescent cells in a tissue go down is to biopsy that tissue, which, is happening more and more in animal studies. But even in the human studies that are progressing for senolytic agents, that step's typically not, planned into the research, right? It's a pretty aggressive step. So, in the human studies, it's more like inferring, we would see this impact in an animal, right? You give the D and Q, the dasatinib and quercetin stack, and they do measure senescent cells in some different tissues. All right, now we design a human study to track something with that, some outcome that's relevant, where maybe we're not being that aggressive at this point, and maybe in the future there is a better marker in the blood that scientists can use.
And just to be clear, current best way is take some sort of biopsy, whether it's can you pull this from skin? Does skin give the right signature? Or typically I think it's from muscle, and then have an expert look at the cells and go okay, from what we know about proper cell behavior, that you have some certain percentage of senescent cells in there. That's the current best way to really understand the senescent cells.
Yeah, it's really the only way, but it would be, while this would be a general rule of thumb, right? With each decade, we'll be expected to have more senescent cells, body burden of them, but they won't accrue evenly in all tissues, right? So if you wanted to know really what's going on, say in adipose tissue, you have to look at adipose tissue. You can't infer it from the skin. So, like what you can infer is, I'm 62. I probably have more now in my body than I had when I was 50, and a lot more, than I had when I was 20. So
that makes sense. So how did we first kind of come to understand that these senescent cells were hanging around? What did the research around that? Because you and I kind of went back and forth. There was a timeline that Google offered, and I resolved it. So there wasn't conversations in books in the 1950s about senolytics. It was another word that got broken up, and so Google threw it into the same category. But what's kind of the evolution of like, wow, there are senescent cells here. These are weird. We need to understand them better. What does that path look like?
Yeah, so I would say the origin would usually be traced to Hayflick and Moorhead's research that came to be termed the Hayflick limit. But this was 1961. Before that, the general thought was that cells in a petri dish, basically cell cultures, as long as they were given enough, nutrients, good environment, they were immortal. They would just, be there forever. And what Hayflick discovered is that at least that specific human cell line that he looked at, after a maximum of 50 replications, the cells they couldn't divide anymore. They were done, right? So that at the time, they didn't have the idea of senescence or cellular senescence that we would have now. So that name didn't go to it, but that idea that, at some point cells just stop making daughters, that probably has something to do with aging. And then I think it was around 72 that someone used the term cellular senescence or senescent cells to describe that idea that cells at some point after so many replications won't replicate anymore. So that the idea of cellular senescence dates to him, but the term probably wasn't used till about 1972 or so. And then I think it was in the early 80s, the understanding of why that happened occurred, right? And that's work that was done on telomeres, right? And the idea of telomere attrition, right? That we lose these end caps progressively each time a cell divides. And once telomere length gets to a certain shortness, then a cell will create what's called a DNA damage response, DNR, I think it is, or DDR. And, so telomeres entered the story then, right? And so then, from then until probably the early 2000s, there was this general idea senescent cells have something to do with aging. It's wrapped up with telomeres, but it was kind of murky, right? I don't think there was a lot of advancement made in those, let's say 2 decades, because the emphasis was more on telomeres than on senescent cells. And then the woman I mentioned, Campisi, that was with the Buck Institute, her lab was the ones that did a lot of work in the 2000s, and she was the one that identified those SASP factors, the SASP, that gets secreted into the microenvironment. And I think that was around 2005. And I think that catalyzed a lot more interest, because all of a sudden it was there's these things aren't just inert, they're actually maybe altering the microenvironment around them. And then the next big jump forward was around 2010. Scientists did a transgene environment. So they basically genetically modified this animal model so that I want to say it was the immune system, but basically cells that created that P16 or P21 marker, I think it was the P16, they genetically modified it so that those animals had a gene that would eliminate those cells as they got older. And what they noticed in these animals is that they just aged in a much healthier way, much leaner bodies, more active, glossy fur, the whole 9 yards. And so at that point, it was wow, there's maybe something really here, right? That not only are these contributing to aging, but if we do things to get rid of them, it seemed to make healthy aging much more probable in these animal models. So the next kind of jump forward was a combination of Scripps Institute of Aging researchers, that's the Scripps in Florida, not the one here in San Diego, and Mayo Clinic got together and basically said, okay, this is what we know about these lingering senescent cells. They do the SASP factors. they don't divide, but they're resisting apoptosis. And a lot of work has been done to date on compounds that can help cells overcome that resistance to apoptosis. Again, mostly in that cancer world, but a lot of that, what I would think of as foundational level of mechanistic science had been done. So they screened a whole bunch of things that would help overcome that resistance to apoptosis. And what they would have described it as SCAP networks. And SCAP, it stands for senescent cells, so SC, anti-apoptotic pathways. So compounds that were known to somehow think of it almost as normalize those protein networks within cells. And of that search, they identified quercetin, which is a flavonoid most thought of as being in onions, but it's most concentrated in the parts of onions that people throw away, the outer skins, basically. Flavonoids always concentrate where the environment interacts with the plant. And then dasatinib, which is a pretty potent immunomodulator used in some cancers. So, and what they found in that, and so I'll just use D and Q for listeners to refer to those going forward. What they found with D and Q is that D was more active as a senolytic compound, like it helped cause senescent cells to go through apoptosis finally in certain tissues and not in others. So as one of the things they reported was adipose tissue, it was activated. And quercetin was active in other ones, but not in adipose. So quercetin was senolytic in endothelial cells, as an example, and I think bone marrow in that particular original study. So that gave them the idea of, okay, well, something could be a senescent cell, but that doesn't mean all tissues have ones that are the same, right? They're heterogeneous almost by nature. What would be thought now is the thing that stressed those cells, that tissue can create its own almost unique pattern of senescent cells, right? They would have commonalities, but there'd be some heterogeneity in different tissues. And that something could be a senolytic compound, but that didn't mean that it would be equally likely to work on all senescent cells and all tissue types. And in that work, they coined the term senolytic to describe those compounds that help fundamentally correct those SCAP networks. So that was, as far as I understand it, the birth of at least the modern use of the term senolytic was compounds that, when taken orally, would help the body eliminate senescent cells.
And that was about 2010. Did I have that about right?
The paper was published in 2015. I know you and I did that, Google book search, and you can start to see the big uptick around 2013, I think. So what you were probably seeing is they were already using that term, but it didn't hit the journals till 2015.
And so D and Q are probably the best researched senolytics. Is that correct at this point?
So there's a few pharma compounds that usually go by like UB237. I'm just making up numbers, but a name like that, right? Because it's a proprietary thing until it advances. So there's a few compounds like that have been studied a fair amount, but the majority of things that I see and I follow the field closely seem to use D and Q. So it's by far, at least from what I've seen, the most common thing used. And most of the studies that have been published today have been in animals, right? That's just where, 9 years down the road from 2015, we're still kind of in the really early days of understanding this field. And, and it's very common that there'll be a lot of preclinical work. And then the next most common thing, at least in a plant compound, would be ficitin. And ficitin kind of slots on the timeline a few years later. And it was the same group of researchers from Mayo and Scripps said, okay, well, if quercetin worked, let's see if there's other plant flavonoids that also may be senolytic. And I believe they tested 10, or at least wrote about 10 in the paper they published around 2017. And what they found is that ficitin was by far the most potent of the ones they tested. So much more potent than quercetin because it was tested against quercetin. They also looked at luteolin and resveratrol and curcumin and apigenin and some of the other ones that some listeners may have heard of in an aging context. And luteolin was also one that showed up as stronger than quercetin in that particular study. But fisetin in that study was then given, so first they did the cell culture thing, right? Like let's put it and see if it disrupts senescent cells in this in vitro experiment. But then they fed it to animals, and it acted as a senolytic. And unlike quercetin, it had some activity in adipose tissue. So it at the time seemed like, oh, this might even be more versatile. This might mimic a lot of what D and Q are doing on its own. We just have to do the fisetin.
Hey, super quick break from the podcast. Hopefully you're loving it. This is a way you can support the podcast and take advantage of a great offer. We're offering 50% off of one of our MCT bottles. MCT is an amazing oil. Add the ESS60 molecule to it. It's even more amazing. All you got to do is leave a review on iTunes, send us a notification that you've left that review. We'll get you a coupon code that'll get you 50% off of our MCT oil and free shipping. Back to the podcast.
Do we have any sense of why in the case of D&Q that they do have impacts in different types of tissues? Is it size? Is it they tend not to get into those areas, or those tissues when they get to senescence have different mechanisms that can be attacked?
Yeah, so I would think it's maybe more mechanisms, and then so this is going to oversimplify it, but the quercetin, fisetin, luteolin tend to work on a specific nutrient sensing pathway as one of their main SCAP network things, and so they're working on that, and then that feeds into proteins that are thought of as pro and anti-apoptotic proteins, right? So it's almost like like a signal then causing, the way I'll often think of it, is voters to change their mind, right? Like a senescent cell, the vote, and it may be 51 to 49, but it's like resist apoptosis. And, those nutrient sensing pathways, all they need to do is shift then a few votes to now we're in favor of apoptosis. And then the cell can finally recapitulate that journey that it should have never ceased, right? It should have gone through apoptosis, right? Like transient one would have. Dasatinib is a tyrosine kinase inhibitor, which were completely different things. That they're receptors on outside cells, but it's a really specific. I think it's SRC kinase is the family, and then there's a few others. So it works in different mechanisms, and the thought is that there's probably more than one mechanism that senescent cells, the lingering ones, are using to linger, and that maybe in some tissues it's what you mentioned. The compound can get into that tissue more readily, but it also could be the ones that are characteristic of that tissue, maybe just disproportionately using a mechanism that one compound wouldn't be as good for, but another one would be better. And then the other thing is this thought that they're additive, that dismantling more and more of these protein networks that are being collectively used to linger may actually be a better way, right, to do it, right? Because really what you're trying to do is just change the vote once. It's not like, giving insulin to a diabetic or thyroid to someone with a thyroid disorder that you need to do every day. You just need to get it to change its mind and go through apoptosis.
Is there a sense that senescent cells in different parts of our biology are better or worse? Like, hey, it's not that big a deal to have senescent cells in skin or in whatever, but it's really bad to have a collection of senescent cells and other kind of tissues.
I'm not aware, like I mentioned, the transient ones. So let's remove those on the table that are doing a functional job, but then are being removed. In an aging context, in general, really every tissue that's been looked at, they contribute to the aging phenotype. So, I guess one case may be, if they're playing more of a fibrotic role and, causing them to be removed would now, harm the tissue because the fibrotic tissue wasn't great, but it was, stabilizing the structure. But the only study I've seen that looked at that and actually gave D and Q, and what it found is the senescent cells it targeted weren't the ones that were playing that structure role. It only targeted the ones like other ones. So I would say at this point the answer would be no, that there doesn't seem to be. We don't want to keep these lingering ones around, and I tend to think of it as a threshold effect, and I've seen some of the researchers use that idea. And threshold effect, I think, is important with something like allergies and pollen. as an example, right? Like I may not experience allergies every spring. I don't, but I know if I get exposed to a massive amount of pollen, I would at least temporarily have allergic symptoms, right? Would just over the I would be so far past that threshold. And that's the idea with senescent cells too, is that below a certain threshold amount in tissues, the tissue's probably going to, by and large, perform in a healthy manner. It's when, we accumulate them past that threshold. And so, that's another way I tend to think about senolytic compounds. The goal isn't to scrub out every senescent cells. That's probably unrealistic. But can we do these in a way that might, progressively take someone back below that threshold that currently was above it?
When we think about the 12 hallmarks of aging, cellular senescence is now one, right? And that's been added since really discovery and kind of understanding of them. Do you think cellular senescence impacts any of the other hallmarks of aging? And I've got the list of the hallmarks of aging. I don't know if you had a chance to glance at it and kind of think.
Yeah. So, the first Hallmarks of Aging paper proposed 9, and cellular senescence was one of the 9. That was 2014. And then those authors updated it I think that the paper was called Hallmarks of Aging, An Expanding Universe in 2023, and added 3 new ones. And the 3 new ones were inflammaging, macroautophagy, so think autophagy, and then dysbiosis. So cellular senescence has always been one of them. It's, the collection's now 12. And the way those authors conceptualize the hallmarks of aging is that telomere attrition on its own, like that would be one that they would think as one that then feeds into senescent cells. And then senescent cells feed into inflammaging, right? So they're not 12 separate things. They're 12 interrelated things that some act to almost cause or contribute towards issues with another one, if that makes sense. So like even dysbiosis, as an example, like senescent cells are thought to aggravate dysbiosis. So the dysbiosis we get with aging, part of that's because senescent cells systemically are creating SAS that's causing that low-grade inflammation, and that low-grade inflammation is affecting the gut microbiota and our barrier functions, right? So I don't know if this answers it, but I don't think of them as all being equal, that some, are more like, consequences of others and then cause others. And then even telomeres. So telomeres would be caused what's thought of as replicative senescence, the Hayflick type of senescence. And that's probably not the main reason that we have senescent cells that linger as we get older. Because 50 divisions seems like, that's not a lot over, say, 90 years. But cells live a while, right? So you'll often see, if you Googled it, maybe lifespan human cell average is 7 years, but that is a really misleading 7 years. It's an average of every tissue, where cells that lie in our GI tract turn over, 60, 90 days, liver 1 to 3 years, heart tissue, it's 4 decades. Neurons last a lifetime, right? So the average there is misleading. And muscle tissue, I think, is about 15 years, but 50 repetitions in long-lived, cells that live a long time is a long time. And then the offspring of them can also divide multiple times, right? So we probably aren't using up the ability to make cells. That's, I don't think, the reason. But over time, what, senescent cell researchers have found is that what they would describe as stress-induced premature senescence. So long before a cell used up its ability to divide and make new cells, some kind of stress would have caused enough damage that the cell became unrepairable. And, at that point, it's now a senescent cell. So that's why I kind of started off these are a special category of stress cells, because stress is probably the main culprit in causing these. And cellular stress isn't exactly the same as what we think of stress, but many of the things are similar, right? Radiation, toxins, improper nutrition. So mitochondrial dysfunction would be a big cellular stressor, which, that's one of the other hallmarks, right? So that one kind of funnels into senescent cells.
Yeah, so it sounds like maybe the hallmarks of aging, they're all intertwined, and they've just kind of outlined what could potentially be addressed. So like, great, like we can potentially address dysbiosis, even though it is tied in. We can potentially address mitochondrial dysfunction separately, and each one of those would probably have a positive impact on the others. Hadn't really thought about the hallmarks of aging in that way. So you've got this understanding of senescent cells, understanding that there are senolytics, and you put together, I think you specifically helped put together a senolytic product. Talk about kind of what kind of products you guys have, and where is the senolytic product the kind of the keystone product, or give us the lay of the land there.
Yeah, so I work for the companies we're usually just thought of as Qualia. Our original name was Neurohacker Collective, but Qualia is how most people know us. And the original project we had was a nootropic, so for people that wanted their brain to perform better. So it was called Qualia Mind. It's still one of our I guess an iconic product for us that is been around since 2018. But its emphasis was let's help office workers and other people that want to get more focus, be more motivated, more productivity, like sustained energy. Fundamentally what I think of almost as attention and executive functions. Let's help them to execute more on that, and that found a nice audience and has done well. It's it could also be a healthy brain supplement, but early on we thought of ourselves more in that nootropic category. And then what happened in by 2018, I was super intrigued in this whole senescent cells and senolytic world, and back-to-back vacations to 1 year it was Portugal, 1 year it was Spain, and the second was in October, November of 2019. It was my read and get smarter on over coffee in the mornings thing on my vacations. And I came back from that 2019 one just thinking, we're probably 10 years early, but 10 years from now, if I had to bet on is the longevity community super excited about NAD boosters or senolytics, I would have put all my money on senolytics at that point. Not to say NAD boosters are nothing, but just in my mind, this looks like it could be massively something. And so at that point, I wanted to the 3 plant compounds that were and for listeners, this was all early science in 2019, but quercetin looked interesting. Fisetin looked interested, and something called piperlongamine. That's some listeners might have heard of piperine, which is sometimes used as a bioenhancer with curcumin. Piperlongamine is a different alkaloid from a different pepper or plant. It's from long pepper instead of black pepper. And that had its own unique mechanism. I had mentioned that quercetin, fisetin, luteolin all seem to work at a minimum on the same nutrient sensing pathway. They're doing other things as well. Piperlongamine is the only thing to date that has this other very unique mechanism. And it's also even more recently thought maybe this mimics some of what dasatinib does mechanistically. That was like an AI kind of generated thing. Let's funnel through all kinds of molecules and see if we can find a natural one that does that. But at the time, piperlongamine, there was really no one was making a concentrated one that I was aware of. But I came from that thinking, okay, if the male people are right and stacking things together is a better way to go than an individual compound, and that senescent cells are heterogeneous and have different, what's helpful to eliminate them in one tissue may not be the same in another, that it would make a lot of sense to stack things together, right? And that there'd be, just like there was well-known compounds that you could look at for these anti-apoptotic pathways and some of these other, I would think of mechanistic things that guided the Mayo and Scripps, that could be applied to, other things. For an example, we know that dasatinib is a tyrosine kinase inhibitor, but specifically an SR3 kinase. Is there plant compounds that have been investigated that? And the answer on that vacation was yes, like milk thistle, soy isoflavones, right? And so then for me at that point, it was I think we could put together, without question, a product I would be excited to take. whether anyone else would want to take it, that not my jam. I'm an engineer. I'm not a sales and marketing person. But, with where I thought like, okay, like this would be very low risk given these compounds with potentially a high reward. Like, let's at least put it together and start, kind of prototyping things and taking it ourselves. So, I remember having a conversation with my boss at the time, this chief science officer and our head of marketing, and they're like, well, all right, is anyone going to buy this? So I'm like, well, I don't know. Like maybe some biohackers, maybe some longevity people like me that, are trying to stitch together their own fisetin and quercetin and piperlongumine. Like at that point, like on, Fight Aging or Longevity, I'd see people like, well, what if I just take, 5 grams of long pepper kind of thing? Like how much piperlongumine will I get? So anyways, I said, probably not many, but it will be a cool thing to do. And, I think it's good for us to, at least attempt to stay on the leading edge of, where the puck may be heading. So anyways, long story short, I got permission. We made Qualia Senolytic, put it up for sale 6 weeks later. Within like a week and a half, it completely sold out. So we went out of stock for like 6 weeks while we were making more. And since then, it's just become our best-selling product, much more so even than Qualia Mind at this point. So there was just a real need for it. And then one of the other obstacles, like before I could get permission, one of the things we do at Qualia is when we prototype a product, we'll always make enough to do what we think of as a beta study. Like think of beta software, like a pre-release version. But it would be more accurately thought of as a pilot study, no placebo control, but we'll just do this intervention. We'll measure some things. We'll make sure it's, not creating side effects, and then figure out something we can measure. And then that was a challenge, right? That's when I first got in touch with True Diagnostics and like, do you have a test I can use? Like, I know these clock tests are cool, and they're like, no, they're not going to work for that. We have no reason to believe. And that's when I dug through clinicaltrials.org and found a few studies that were specifically using the WOMAC scale. And I'm like, oh, well, we can do that. I've used the WOMAC before in practice with people, to see how their joint issues changed when I did an intervention. So let's do that. Let's recruit people with some degree of joint issues. We'll give them the Qualia Senolytic for 2 days on, the time off, because these, as I mentioned, are dosed intermittently. And just do that for a couple cycles and see what happens. And what we saw in that pilot study was about a 65% decrease in subjective symptoms over 3 dosing cycles. So basically 6 days of supplementation over about 5 weeks. So like, okay, this seems to be like, it seems to be helping that small group of people. That's probably, we don't know if it's because, as you pointed out, did it kill off senescent cells? No way to know, right, without doing biopsies, but it seemed to be doing something positive. It was really well tolerated. Let's turn it into a product. And since then, we've done a placebo-controlled study doing that same approach, and we again saw in that 65% decrease range, and statistically significant from placebo. So a huge increase in subjective energy levels, which kind of makes sense. Senescent cells, inflammation, we know they impact the brain. So at this point, we're repeating that study. Should be done, by the middle of September, end of September. We should have the data. And then, we'll maybe look at other areas after. And, if there's ever a blood test we can use, that would be next on our roadmap to do that.
Yeah, pull that into it. So talk a little bit about the concept of the 2 day cycling, right? So 2 days on, and then some period, is that once a month, and why did you kind of land there?
Yeah, so the original idea, and so intermittent dosing, and I think one of the Mayo researchers, Kirkland, I think he might have called it hit and run dosing, early on. But the idea was dasatinib's pretty potent, right? Maybe not the best thing to do every day for someone that doesn't need it as an oncology medicine. Quercetin we know is safe. Like people, the studies on quercetin that have done a reasonable dose every day for months on it, right? But that original intermittent dosing came out of what's the best risk reward trade-off doing these things. And then the thought was, okay, we don't have to occupy a receptor constantly like you might need with some medications, or supply a hormone every day. We just need to transiently disrupt these SCAP networks that are allowing the cell to resist apoptosis. We just needed to change its mind once, right? So let's just, instead of, doing a massive dose of these every day, let's just do it intermittently and see what happens. So it was almost baked in from the get-go. And then the Senescent study alone did the same thing. They did that intermittent approach. And in animal studies, the window of time between dosing cycles can vary. I've seen it, 4 days up to like a couple weeks. In humans, most of the studies that are registered on clinicaltrials.org, because many of these are by that same research group out of Mayo, typically do a dose and then anywhere from a couple weeks to a month for the next one. And that would be like with the D&Q as an example. So early on, we just decided, okay, we'll do the same approach. We'll do that hit and run. And I don't know if this would make sense to your engineering mind, but it makes sense to mine, right? Like I always think of everything in signal to noise ratio, right? Like, so we would know, like as an example, and this is, I think it might be called the Weber-Fechner law. I could be mispronouncing that, but it's an old physiological law that had to do with how our visual and hearing senses respond to signals. And what they found, in a long story short, is that it's proportional change that matters. It's not the quantity of something, right? It's the proportional change, right? So, like how did it stand out from the background noise? Like what proportion do you need? Which is why, decibels are a log scale as an example, and why if, you hold a sound unchanging, our brain will ignore it very quickly. But when you think of noise for listeners, I know and I know, but listeners may not, like think of the noise level being you're in like a restaurant and there's the background conversation and noise, right? That's the noise level. Now, someone 3 tables away says, Greg or Chris, we're going to probably hear that. Like that's going to stand out. Like for that, there's enough signal because our brain's tuned to that. But so receptors are always paying attention for signals that have to stand out from noise. And I mentioned that, quercetin, luteolin, fisetin as examples, at least part of their activity on senescent cells is on nutrient sensing pathways, right? The pathways listening for a signal in the environment around them. And so thought experiment, if we give the same amount of these compounds every day, I would think that is potentially at least creating something that's going to be ignored over time. Right? But when we give massive amounts in just a couple of days, we create this huge proportional change, just an immense signal, right? So it also, from that signal to noise, my expectation, and I might be proven wrong, is these plant compounds may not work if you gave the same amount in quality senolytic and instead giving it all in 2 days, said, oh, we'll just take these capsules and take it over 12 days instead. We'll just take them evenly. I wouldn't expect they would do the same thing, not with senescent cells, right? We're trying to create this massive signal from the background noise.
Yeah, and there's natural things that we think have a positive impact, right? Like so, intermittent fasting. One of the things of intermittent fasting is to try and foster apoptosis, right? And so you're looking at these signals that signify a condition whereby the physiology needs to make a change. That makes sense, and I like your concept of these cells are constantly voting, and they're 49 to 51 voting to stay alive, every second, and then you just got to convince them to vote, the other way one time, and then the cell goes away. This has been a fascinating conversation. Really loved diving into this. We're really kind of at time, maybe a little over time, but I have my wrap-up questions.
Sure.
Was there anything else kind of generally about senolytics and maybe qualia? I know we're going to give a link. We're going to give a coupon code. But is there anything generally that we didn't touch on that you think is important to touch on?
I mean, there's probably another hour we could talk about, but no, I would say the most important things for listeners is that idea of intermittent dosing, right? I've seen other companies sell, like Senolytics, and it's, maybe a trivial amount of fisetin. Like you need a big dose to create that signal to noise. So it's like, there needs to be enough of these compounds. It's likely with the plant-based ones going to be more beneficial doing ones that are stacked together than, as an example, ficetine alone. And then, like that intermittent dosing. So, just for listeners, I take the Senolytic the first weekend of every month. So in our studies, we've done it as someone do it as frequently as twice a month. And our general recommendation would be once a month. And for a younger person, that would be expected to have relatively few senescent cells, then I would say, treat it like you would a periodic fast or detox, maybe once a quarter. So that would be the last thing, like depending on where you are on the symptom scale and the aging curve, like, maybe do this, the once a month like I do, maybe do it a little more aggressively, to try to get things down to a threshold and then go to once a month. And if you're younger, and want to experiment, then, space it out maybe a lot more.
That makes perfect sense. All right, so here we have our wrap-up questions. Dr. Kelly, do you have a target age that you would like to live to?
So, have you ever seen Finding Nemo? I'm sure I would get, right? So, when I saw that, which would have been whenever it came to the theater, there's the scene where Nemo kind of finds the sea turtles, and it's kind of a surfer dude sea turtle is how I remember it. Yeah. And Nemo's like, well, how old are you? And he says, oh, like I'm 120 and still young at heart or something like that. So ever since then, I've always said, Dr. Greg ages in sea turtle years. And that number, and I might be making up that number. Maybe they never said 120 in it, but that's stuck in my head ever since then. Like that 120 would be my target.
Very cool. And how long do you think humans can live?
I mean, at this point, what I saw something recently, and that there's, in the oldest old, there's like this slow creep higher and higher with more and more people surviving past certain years. I think right now the longest lived might have been 117, like that we have good data for. So I would say, with today's technology and the pace we're on, I would say 120 is starting to get into like maybe achievable. Yep.
Very cool. What 2 to 3 protocols, habits, mindsets, let's call them shortcuts, because everybody likes shortcuts, to longevity and a long health span that you would share?
So I think something like Senolytic is something I know I do, right? So that's, I think foundational, just because there's no other great way to get rid of those. You'd mentioned, intermittent fasting. I think of that as a strategy more for autophagy than for apoptosis, right? It helps prevent senescent cells, but once they're senescent, they're really good at resisting going through apoptosis. Okay. I think the fasting mimicking diet, Valter Longo's technology, fantastic, right? Doing that, at least once, if not a couple times a year, makes a lot of sense to me. His group's doing quite an extensive amount of research. That probably does help at least get rid of some senescent immune cells. I think his labs looked at that. But, again, autophagy and all kinds of other things. So that makes a lot of sense. And then I'm a huge, let's make sure I think of things like in financial investment, like you want a good portfolio. And I saw a statement, performance in most areas is a matter of doing the most obvious thing over and over for long periods of time. So I always think let's not ignore the most obvious, right? Let's dial in exercise, eating well, sleep, managing stress, all the basics, the foundation, right? Like those in the Navy was my most sleep deprived time, right? Not by circumstances. I didn't have a lot of choice. But, since the Navy, I remember having conversations with other health practitioners back in the late 90s, and they're like, yeah, I only need 4 or 5 hours sleep. I'm like, I'm happy to need 8 and give my body what it needs, right? Where now, the biohackers and people like yourself, everyone realizes sleep was neglected for a long period of time, and it's hard to perform at our best over many years if we're not prioritizing sleep. So the foundational things. And then, I think there's some really, I think Brian Johnson blueprint is worth following. The doc he works with, I think is Oz Garcia. But, what Brian's doing is really cutting edge. But if I had to bank on what other area is super cool that we're not quite there yet, it would be something to do with making the gut microbiome younger. So that there's been a fair amount of studies on fecal microbial transplant, basically transplanting, the microbiome or microbiota from a young mouse to an older one and vice versa. And like huge impacts. Young blood has been another area like that. But I think the microbiome, like if I could only study one thing for the rest of my career, it would be the microbiome, the gut microbiome specifically.
Yeah, I think we're going to learn so much about the microbiome, and yeah, you can take a rat that doesn't have Alzheimer's and do a fecal transplant from a rat that does have Alzheimer's and give it Alzheimer's and then undo that with that reverse. I think that's pretty amazing, and even how recently we've discovered Akkermansia, and which turns out to be a keystone bacteria. Like these are exciting times for poop.
And like you had asked, what are the things we have a quality symbiotic that has a resistant starch that in humans has caused a bloom in Akkermansia, and it's a product I take almost every day because I think again super sensible thing to do. Like that product has basically fibers, fermented foods, some probiotics, some postbiotics, and it's fundamentally just augmenting the diet in smart ways. So, which I think makes sense, right? Until, like you had mentioned, dysbiosis, one of the 12 hallmarks. Let's directly address that if we can.
Yeah. What are 1 to 2 things that people get absolutely wrong regarding longevity and a long health span?
So I think often it's like one thing would be just wrapping the two things up like they're together. Like even if we don't move the needle on lifespan, if we move the needle on health span, that's huge. Like on average, one of the things, so people probably have heard, the average lifespan is X. Let's just say it's 77. Like, that takes into account, children, buddies of mine, committed suicide, died in car accidents, you name it, when they were really young. Like that blends all of those together. What, would matter for me at 62 is what's thought of as life expectancy after 60. And then there's something called like healthy life expectancy after 60. And in the most recent thing that looked at that, on average in North America, I want to say it was 82 for life expectancy after 60, but about a third of that time was in really ill health, right? So, say for, roughly you have 22 years, about 7 of them are going to be, how my grandfather might have been in assisted living, how my mom is now in assisted living, not really getting to live their lives their way. So I think, the key thing first and foremost for me is let's eat into that. Let's give people, let's move life expectancy after 60 and healthy life expectancy after 60 close together, right? And that I think, the way to do that in simple is we need to start, just like with finances, to retire comfortably financially. Most of us need to start investing, well before we're 60. So this is Sam. I think like we need to do more, start early, and don't miss out on the big wins, right? With sleep and diet and exercise. So I would think, one of the things, and this has been changing with people like, Brian Johnson, is let's start doing these way before we're having issues with aging, because that's likely the best way to move the needle on and close that gap. And then, I think the technologies to really massively extend lifespan are, I'm not banking on them in my lifetime. Be, cherry on top if someone figures that out. But that would be the main focus, is that. And then the last thing is just how I think about finances, right? Like, what's the risk reward? If the reward is unknown, but potentially good, and the risk is almost no, then almost going back to our signal to noise, like the ROI, the risk reward may be worth it. And what's always been interesting to me with scientists versus biohackers are really skewed to be willing to self-experiment. Many of the lab scientists that are doing this, if you ask them, well, are you doing all this, D&Q research? Are you taking those? Oh, no, I'm going to wait till it's established, right? So like for me, I'm more like, all right, well, what's the potential reward? Is it particularly risky? And, then that makes sense. So anyways, I would just say, not really a myth, but maybe that's a useful way for other people to also think about, whether or not an intervention makes sense for them to do.
Yeah, I really like, and I jotted down kind of investing too late in your health. That's a mistake that people are making, investing in your health and longevity too late. Just like investing financially, you need to, the sooner you start, the better. I like that. Dr. Kelly, how can people contact you?
So our website is Qualia Life, and it's QUALIA, life.com. I periodically, do things on their X, maybe more than even our social media person. But that would be the most likely thing that I put things I'm interested in or reading in on the Qualia X account. And then Instagram, someone else handles, but Instagram's our big media account. But, a really useful way is, we have our own podcast. I tend to focus on interviewing authors, but you'll find the Collective Insights podcast. You'll get to hear me more playing your role in the background and asking great questions. And then for all of the Qualia products, I create what I think is almost long white papers about, so like Qualia Senolytic, there'll be we can put it, make sure it's in show notes, but it will talk about, what are senescent cells, what each ingredient in the Qualia Senolytic is, why it's in there, why the amount is in there. I tried to, in these blog posts, give insight into how I thought about it and why we put, the product together in the way we did, so that, we as a company are transparent, and that, users will then know how I thought about something that I've helped make as a product for Qualia.
Very cool. What in the near future are you excited about?
I'm super excited about plant medicines. Not really, the thing, but I think plant medicines are to me, a really intriguing area, both of, science and to see where things are heading as a society. The aging area in general, right? I'm liking that, people like Brian Johnson are getting big followings and are like, I have, one of a close friend of mine, their son is already following Brian Johnson and has been for a bit, so as a 40-year-old, they're already thinking about things that, my grandparents just accepted, right? That they were going to get older and lose function. So I'm excited to see that maybe because of personalities and social media, that what used to be a super niche thing, right? Like the longevity thing is penetrating into an age group that can start to make great investments at a younger age.
Yeah. 40, investing in health and in your finances. All right. So you can find the Qualia products, qualialife.com. There's a link for our audience. So it's qualialife.com/live beyond. There is a code. It's called Live Beyond. And you get 15% off of any Qualia order when they use that link. Actually, it gets applied when you use the link. Again, qualialife.com/live beyond. Dr. Kelly, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Live Beyond the Norms podcast. Make sure to subscribe and follow. Also, make sure not to be that guy, the guy sharing this podcast with people who are not interested in living beyond the norms. If you would like to learn more about the ESS60 molecule, the molecule responsible for the single longest longevity experimental result on mammals in history, a full 90% extension of life, visit myvitalc.com. That's myvitalc as in carbon.com.